This is a paper entitled Information Laws and Usage about the FOIA Act. The First Amendment and the Freedom of Information Act are two active components of American protections. The United States first enacted the First Amendment in 1791 in the Bill of Rights, created by the founding members of the United States government. Alternatively, Freedom of Information Act was created in 1967, signed into law by President Johnson. It was made for government transparency, openness, and accountability. These laws are both used regularly today. They were created to protect the citizens of the U.S. and other places that have similar structured governments. The First Amendment gives citizens the freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition, whereas the Freedom of Information Act requires openness from the government involving requested records, promptness with records in general, the right of civilians to request records, a speedy response time, and fee structures according to who is requesting information. Many people rely on these laws. They are considered fundamental rights. They protect the nurture an existing relationship of the government and people. Understanding the complexities of the First Amendment brings up the question of its history. During the publication of the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment was implicated as a method to remove ties with British rule of the colonies. It was meant to be common law, protecting such liberties for newly coming immigrants in existing communities. The use of the amendment was also used to resist laws prohibiting religion, speech, rights of the press, assembly, and that of petitioning. As the relationship of the laws concerning liberty grew, the persistence of these rights became fundamental as the country started growing with its foundations to common day. The First Amendment was readily shaped the way citizens perceive, endure, and share information with others. The perceived concept of the First Amendment is regularly argued in courts today. Some perceived questions are about alienation of individuals or businesses and infringements of the rights. Such an example is the issue of required food labels. If it was required, it would go against the First Amendment and freedom of press. Upon study, it was recognized even though some countries allow mandatory use of labels with symbols and required information, it goes against First Amendment rights in the United States. Pomerantz et al. It brings up the question of whether it is the correct usage of the law to protect consumers and at what cost. There are laws protecting consumers already, but it is seen in a way to protect buyers' nutritional value. However, the argument is different because of the First Amendment. Another popular example of the First Amendment is the ethics of Apple Incorporated and the Federal Bureau of Investigations. In the case, Apple was able to unlock the phone of a deceased terrorist's cell phone, but refused on the grounds that it would have broken a law having to do with the Freedom Act passed in 2015, which was related to the government whistleblower Edward Snowden. Though Apple refused to give them access to the information, the government was able to go through a lower court and obtain access. Nelson. The Freedom Act had to do with the First Amendment rights. Was still objected in a way. In this case, an organization or business can take a side having to do with law. That is the way the courts needed. In this case, an organization or business can take a side having to do with the law. That is the way the courts indeed work, and how the First Amendment must be applied and determined. In both examples, personal freedoms are questioned, and it takes an organization to apply the law. It is the personhood who the law is applicable in some cases, but still relevant to both government regulations, oversight, and organization determination. Regulations and oversight from the stance of the First Amendment is everlasting and only beckons a realization of how the country will determine oversight and act with such oversight is the Freedom of Information Act. Its stake in the government is to provide access to information from the state and federal governments. It went into effect on July 4th, 1967, and was signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson. The act was to create transparency, accountability, and openness, allowing citizens the right to request and access government documents and records. The ability to access information digitally has been around since 1996 in the United States. The FOIA has been gravely important in terms of information collected by people in the country and in other countries as well. There have been new apparent laws introduced on how to do appropriate searches on the subject, and from the point of view from government bureaucracy, it is noted that someone should update their methods every 2 years, Hanabas. As records are more heavily searched, the dependence on the FOIA becomes more prevalent and costly. The cost calculations from the police records in England and Wales during the establishment of the Freedom of Information Act of 2000 was a heavy burden. The cost of an FOIA request had to do with the ability of the government to confer such access, Kingston et al. The ability for the government to obtain such records is a costly structure and seems to be a crucial accessibility point for someone requesting such records. It is the same burden in all of the countries of the study. Oversight is well-rounded and oriented to the particular law, and just like that of laws protecting the First Amendment, the FOIA revolves around the same classification. The laws protect each other from output, input, and control measures. The implications of the First Amendment in the FOIA are mixed between manifest of language and emotion, because emotional components are inevitably a part of reasoning. Identifying emotionally can't be the end of the inquiry into the acceptability of a government regulation. A doctrine that condemns emotional manipulations is particularly to block policy innovations, since the emotional valences of existing arrangements are harder to see. Tushnet. It is seen that, in part, emotion is a stake of government reliance on law, just like that of consumers. The development has a structure that can afford different cues, such social norms and advertisement. Even though it might not seem like laws regarding abortion or that of smoking are related to the First Amendment, they are directly related to the motion of which. It is stressed that most ideas having to do with the FOIA or First Amendment are interconnected and connected from a component of something further than a language or a frame. The laws are, however, neutral, and the stance is obligatory. Therefore, the law creates standard of ethics and philosophy between what is determined and what is considered in both application of law and other freedoms. The true value of freedom is the cost of fundamental rights. An orientation into the ethics and usage of the First Amendment and that of the FOIA requires a daily upkeep of the system. They are very important rights, which concern most personal liberties in the world in the present day. Governments and regulations' tendencies shape the way we see laws and how society functions. The ability to measure those functions in the instance of FOIA is painstakingly just as important. Cost measures and structure are very important concepts, no matter how personal they can get. Finally, the acknowledgement of common language is almost always present, complementing liberty and appeal. It is apparent that the FOIA and First Amendment are fundamental rights that help develop a great deal of what is present in the world.